Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to the Korg MS-20-V tutorial series. I'm going to have a look at the sequencer today. If you're enjoying this series and you want to help support me, check out the Patreon and YouTube channel member links below. It's a fantastic way to do that. Huge thanks to everybody who's signed up so far. It really means a lot to me. Let's just dive straight in. Turn the sequencer on. Make sure it's on. There are actually two different power buttons. There's a big chunky power button over here, but you can see it does exactly the same job. So once it's on, I'm going to press a key. And now you can see this 12-note sequencer basically playing some steps. Now there is a way to get it to generate a 24-step sequence, but we'll worry about that a little bit later. The default behavior, as indicated by this sequence mode, is that all three steps of all three channels, the ABC, play simultaneously. So as you can see, we're getting this set of three lights running across from step number 1 to 12. That gives us three independent routes that we can send to different places simultaneously. By default, channel C is the one that controls pitch. And you can see that we've got a normal connection from channel C out to control keyboard control voltage. We can obviously override that pointlessly, but let's do it anyway by plugging in a cable from the out to the VCO 1 and 2 control voltage in. So this is basically going to do exactly the same job. And we've had no impact whatsoever on the sounds, just to prove that that's a normal connection, but we can override it. In addition to there being a normal connection for pitch, there's also a normal connection for the envelopes. And this patch point below indicates this, trigger out, and we're normaled into envelope generators 1 and 2. Now, as with any normal connection, bear in mind that if you plug a cable in somewhere, you're going to override that normal behavior. So because we need envelope generator 2 to be firing to hear all of those notes, if I plug a cable in here somewhere completely inoffensive, cutoff frequency isn't going to have any impact on the sound because we've got our low pass filter basically not doing anything. But now when I press a note, we don't hear all of these individual attacks because we no longer have envelope 2 firing. So just bear in mind that you're still going to need those triggers. If you start plugging cables in here, you're going to need to fire those triggers. And now we're back to our standard behavior by plugging in a cable into the trigger in, which is basically going to make sure that envelope 2 fires every time. So it's taken us a minute to actually figure out what the default behavior of this sequence is, because we completely take it for granted that when you press a key on a keyboard, you go in a sequencer, you're going to hear a sequence. But of course, in a modular synthesizer, nothing is taken for granted. In fact, even pitch isn't particularly taken for granted. As I said, it's channel C that's generating the notes. Here we've got our keyboard control voltage coming out. All three channels are generating control voltages. Don't get confused with that. It's just that channel C has a normal connection into your keyboard control voltage, and that's what's generating pitch. But in order to do that properly, the sequencer has to know what pitches to output, what control voltages to output to basically correspond to those pitch changes. And so channel C is the only one of the three channels that explicitly has a pitch option. If I switch that to plus or minus 5 volts, the first thing that's happened is that all of these controls have been reset to 12 o'clock. But now when I increase or decrease these knobs, I'm getting voltage changes. So it's still going to change the pitch, but I no longer have that direct equivalence. If I wanted to work out exactly what those pitches needed to be, I would have to slow the sequencer right down, send it through a tuner, and basically do it that way. So if I pull this right down to as slow as I possibly can, you can see that these pitches aren't absolutely spot on because they're now just generating arbitrary control voltages. And so I'd have to right click and change very small amounts. There you go, pretty much nailed that. F-3 is as close as we're going to get. Just go to one more decimal point and see if we can hit it absolutely perfect. No, I can't get better than -3 here. So it's a really painstaking, arduous job if you're trying to change control voltages into exact pitches. And for that purpose, on channel C, they do all of that heavy lifting for you. And now you're changing in steps of semitones. That's not the case for channels A and B. They're not intended to be pitch controls. This is where we get our far more organic kind of flavour. So let's crank the speed up a little bit. I'm going to switch the sequencer rate type to Hertz, so I can get a nice fast sequence going. And I'll change all of the pitches on all of the dials. Now you're only hearing 6 of those steps at the moment. They're controlled by these trigger buttons down below. So as you can see, each knob has its own trigger button. When I turn it on, now you're going to hear that new control voltage. And so you can create interesting syncopated rhythms. You can also portamento between them. There are 2 different controls for managing portamento. Firstly, we've got these individual note-by-note controls. I'll slow it down so that we can hear this a little bit more clearly. But as things stand, when I press a key, you're not actually going to hear any portamento. Because we've got these master dials over here, I need to dial some channel C in and make it nice and slow. And there you can hear the portamento. Did you also hear that gap in the sound? So we hear a note and then there's silence. I'll just hold the key down. Silence, and then the note gets played. That silence is generated by this gate knob. So this is basically how long that gate stays open for. At 50%, guess what? Half of the step is covered by the control voltage output. If I crank that gate all the way up, it doesn't go past 95%. So you're always going to get a tiny little bit of no control voltage, and trying to differentiate between notes on and notes off. This is all control voltages. So now when I press the key, for the majority of the time, you're going to hear sound. There's a really small gap, and there you heard the portamento coming in. Pull channel C's portamento back down. And now it's effectively off. As you can see from the dial, it's actually technically still on, but so fast that it's basically off. Let's turn that back up again. Everything that we've done so far has still only been involving channel C. We haven't looked at A and B at all yet. So let's do that next. Well, by default, channels A and B aren't doing anything. So let's give channel A a task, and I'm going to wire it into the low pass filter cutoff frequency. So now, as we saw earlier in the series, if I want to dial some low pass filter in, this is the control that I'm going to do to enable this particular input. And well, you can see when I hover over it, that little yellow light comes on. So let's dial some of that in. I'll bring my frequency, low pass filter frequency down. Now at the moment, all of the control voltages are consistent. So now when I start dialing in some of these control voltages, and this is why we don't deal in pitches now, we're just dealing in control voltage changes. At the moment, all of these modulations, they're really quite subtle. You see 0.5, 1 volt, 0.408. That's because this master switch just underneath the channel A label is currently set to plus or minus 1 volt. If I want those modulations to be more extreme, flick the switch over onto plus or minus 5. And when you've got such extreme control voltage changes, something like -4 is going to pull that low pass filter right down to the point where we don't hear anything. So if we have a section of notes in the middle of the sequence, it's going past audible range. It goes without saying that these patch points also have multiple outs, so I can patch that, for instance, into frequency modulation. But I can dial a different amount of frequency modulation in by just increasing this control a little bit. But at subtle levels we just get kind of a nice little bit of twisting of the pitch. We've been fully utilising all 12 steps of the sequence so far, but obviously we can pull that down. Let's just use 8 of them. Because we've got these 2 gaps, we've got quite a nice syncopated effect there. Now let's make it a 16-step sequence for the control voltage modulations, and we do that in the sequence mode. Click on this little symbol. And at the moment we're in sequencer pattern A plus B plus C, which basically means they're all parallel. If I switch to the lower legend, it's going to cycle through A and then step down to B, whilst doing C constantly in the background. So C is only ever a maximum of 12 steps, but A and B can be combined. There's a bug in the interface here. I'm going to select loop mode, but when we come out you'll see it says loop retrig. It's a trivial thing. It is actually in loop mode, not retrig. I'll show you the difference between those two shortly. But now we're going to step through the first 8 steps of channel A and then step down to the 8 steps of channel B. Sounds pretty cool. When either A or B is outputting a control voltage, it's going to be doing something, but for the other half of the time, it's not. So if we use these 2 channels as modulation sources, we're going to get a really interesting effect where they're only actually doing anything 50% of the time. So for instance, I'll take this pitch change away to make things a little bit cleaner. We've got channel A plugged into the low pass filter. I'm going to plug channel B into the high pass filter and dial some high pass filter in. And now I'm just going to change a load of random controls on that. Do. And as you'll hear, each of those filters is only doing anything for half the time. So you get a completely different sound depending on whether or not channel A is in control, outputting its control voltage changes to the low pass filter, and the high pass filter is basically doing whatever its controls tell it to. There are no control voltage inputs coming from the outside world. And then they swap duties, and suddenly the high pass filter takes over with its channel B settings, and channel A goes to having the really low kind of dull thudding sound because its default low pass filter control takes over. I'll just dial a bit of resonance in so it's a little bit easier to hear with the resonance spikes. And it's a really easy way to generate a really interesting sequence. If you want something a little bit more like consistent with your timing, you can switch back to 8 step again and it'll just kind of fit in with the feel of the groove, probably a little bit easier. To demonstrate the difference between standard loop and retrig, firstly I'll switch back to A plus B plus C because the legend is correct. Loop mode first. This is all to do with when the sequence is active, so I have to press keys down for any of this to be significant. So what I'll do is jump briefly back to hardware mode so that you can see me pressing the notes on the keyboard. So let's get a sequence going by pressing C. Now I'm going to press an E. The sequence is going to switch to that note. Can you see that I held that C down? I can let it go now. As long as there's some sort of control coming from the keyboard, the sequence is going to play smoothly. And every time I press a note, the sequence carries on playing smoothly in the background. As long as I have at least one key down, the thing is always running, and then the key that I press is determining the pitch of the sequence, the default pitch of the sequence that gets played. In retrig mode, every time I press a key, regardless of whether or not anything else is going on, the entire sequence is going to restart. So I'll do the same thing, but this time it's easier to stay in this mode so that you can see the red lights of the sequence basically restart every time. So I'm pressing 3 notes, 4 notes, 5 notes. I'm holding all of these notes down. Every time I press a new note, it goes back to the beginning of the sequence. In single mode, once I get the sequence going, it'll get to the end and then it'll stop. So I've still got this key held down. Doesn't matter, it's played the sequence once and then it stops. So it's basically like a single firing, one envelope kind of thing. The last control that we need to look at, which is pretty straightforward, but I'll do it anyway, clock speed modulation. So if I take an output, let's say from the modulation generator, and plug it in here, and crank a load of that in, I'm going to make my modulator run really slowly. And there's the triangle shape of the modulation generator modulating the sequence speed. Very cool. And that's the sequencer. Hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did, please hit the like button. I'll see you for the next one. Thanks very much.